I'm recording now, so say hi.
Hi.
All right. That's like saying hi to yourself. You realize that. Okay.
And the other periods.
That's true. And when these things go viral on YouTube, you know.
Yes.
The YouTube. When they go viral on the YouTube. All right. Here's what I want you to be aware of. This section on the two logics is really like FYI. There's a few terms that I'd like you to be familiar with, but if you don't grasp this and if it seems a little too philosophical, it's going to have no bearing on your understanding of the course. Okay? It's just one of these initial things that it's nice to cover. There really is not different type. I mean, there's different styles of logic, but there is only logic. There is no English logic or African logic or Asian logic. It doesn't work like that. Or Buddhist logic. I mean, logic is logic. But if you did happen to read through the book, Kraft, and that's how you pronounce that author's name, Dr. Kraft, he speaks of the difference between Roman numerals and Arabic numerals. Okay, so there is a matter of efficiency that's involved. So the logic that we are not going to learn is propositional logic. This is mathematical logic. All right. Now, if you are going to become a programmer and write code, this would be very, very useful for you because it's very efficient for complex applications, and therefore it's time saving. Okay, it's just time saving. There's not a lot to write after that. You'll see, though, it's not as practical. Okay, and if it were true that you were simply being good at this made you a rational person, then people like Sheldon and Dr. Spock would be the most, reasonable human beings in the world. I know Spock wasn't human, but you get my point. All right. Now, there are downsides to this, and these are big, fancy words that are very easy to understand. And when I say downsides, I am not like trashing it. I'm just saying that, there's an uptick to it, and the fact of that is that it's very efficient. And it can produce what we need to produce. But there's also the other flip-flop. Oh my God, I can't even talk. The other side of the coin. The reality, and when I say contra, I'm just saying generally speaking. Now, epistemological realism, big fancy word, all it really means is that you can know reality. All right? It doesn't necessarily foster an attitude that says you can know reality. And I'll have to explain it as we go through the course.
Wait, it does or does not?
It does not. Contra means it's against the understanding that you can know reality. Now, next semester, when we start getting into the philosophy and culture, I can talk to you about a guy you don't need to know anything about him now, Rene Descartes. And we start to have concerns about whether or not we can know what's out in the world. And we can have arguments over whether or not this pen really exists. Now that may sound silly to you, and nobody may particularly have questioned that, but it has ripple effects. Okay, it has ripple effects, particularly with the human person and human sexuality, and we'll get into that and why that's an issue. All right, but it doesn't. But this type of logic doesn't foster an environment where I can say yes, I know that this pen exists, and it doesn't just exist in my mind. All right. Metaphysical realism, and again, if that sounds a little convoluted to you, you don't quite get it, that's okay, because that's not imperative for this point at this point in the course. Just know exactly what I'm talking about. Metaphysical realism is the idea that universal concepts apply to reality, and I'll tell you what that means. We're going to talk more about that next week too. Universal concepts apply to reality. So if I say I have a concept known as a writing utensil, and I say these are both writing utensils, right? You couldn't know they're both writing utensils unless there was something universal between them. Now, you might say, well, that's obvious. Well, it's not obvious. And again, it's not imperative for this course. Next semester, you will get it. There's something called nominalism that says there's no such thing as universal. It's just a category we place these two things in. So they don't have a nature in themselves. Now, people often get caught into a what do you want to say, like a catch-22 when they say, those chairs are different. I mean, once you say those chairs, if you're not talking about something that has a universal, we get into trouble. But again, if it sounds a little convoluted, it's just saying, I'm saying that there's something that I can know about both of these universals, okay? That they are both writing utensils. Again, I'll make that clear next semester when it's important and you know what that is. The other thing is because propositional logic is a lot of like P's and Q's, you know, if P then Q. Remember last semester, well, I guess it was last semester, but last year, when I was teaching utilitarian ethics, like the end justifies the means? This almost fosters an attitude where we're interested in getting to an end. All right? How do I get to Q? Now, I'm not making a universal blanket statement that people that are in, you know, propositional logic are utilitarian ethicists, but you'll find that, okay? I mean, you know, science, as great as it is as an art, and as a science, often doesn't ask what we ought, it asks what can we do? You know, are we able to do this? Well, then let's do it, you know. Now, we're going to have so many new things, like I mentioned to you the other day, that I could talk about in morality this year. You know, literally three genetic parents, artificial wombs, so many things. Yes?
Can you give an example of the if P then Q?
Let's say, well, we could probably do something practical. Like if I develop the ability to have three genetic parents, then that will allow, then the Q would be, then two women can have biological children together. All right? So, I mean, now I know that I'm forcing that into something that I would find contrary, but it's just if P then Q. Now, maybe just 1 second, before we go any farther than that, let me give you the reverse and see if that clears any of it up. And if it doesn't, then we'll see. What you are going to learn is syllogistic logic, okay? Also known as Aristotelian logic. Sometimes people throw Thomistic in there, St. Thomas, but you know it comes from Aristotle. And I have to share with you that when I learned this, I learned it probably the hardest, most convoluted way it could ever be taught by a teacher that I swear to God is a masochist. I'll have to bring in the book and show you what my logic book looks like. I mean, you know, it was actually Aristotle's work, you know, posterior analytics, interior analytics. I mean, it's not systematic like this. It's just his writings. And when we get to talking about something called mood and figure, I know that means nothing to you now. I'll show you how I learned it, and you're going to say, that is the most complex thing I ever heard, and there's simpler ways to do it, and I'm going to say you are absolutely correct. All right? But anyway, also, this is all in a collection of books. Organon is the book that Aristotle put together. It's called Instrument. It's just a collection of 6 books, or 6 short books, where it works, whatever you want to call it. All right? So the Organon has some of his other writings in it. I have the writings separate. I have them together. You know, and the book I have on posterior analytics and interior analytics has, you know, the Greek on one side and then the English on the left. It's ridiculous, I think. I mean, that would have been okay if you're a monk and this is all you do all day is study logic. But if you have anything else to do, which may include nothing more than making breakfast, you know, there's better ways to do this. All right. Now, syllogistic logic is not as refined and as accurate as propositional logic, but it's based on common sense, okay? So it's a little more applicable to our daily lives, and it's deductive. Do you guys know what deductive logic is? You start from the general and you go to the specific. Usually the physical sciences start with this, what they do. They start, you know, the science, see, first of all, science as we think of it today is only empirical. But science really just means, you know, the systematic study of a thing. So when I say that theology is a rigorous science, I'm not trying to stretch the word science to include. Originally, that's what it meant, okay? But science will start with the particulars and then make some prediction about the general. And it's inaccurate because, you know, we might say, you know, all geese are white, but we have not seen all geese. So we have to just basically assume that. And one day we find a goose that's not white, we realize we're wrong, which is how science works. That's not to diminish it. That's its limitations, okay? But we're not doing that. So they're both deductive, but syllogistic logic is going to be more to be more practical. And this last part, probably even more important. According to Peter Kraft, it fosters natural law ethics. Natural law ethics knows that there are substances and there are essences, and things have a nature. So rather than working through everything if P then Q, which we'll talk a little bit about that, we talk in terms of all men are mortal. Now, that is without a doubt an absolute. We don't say, we don't have to see, or we know that the nature, but see, you have to agree with the nature, the metaphysical realism of something, right? If we know all men are mortal, we don't have to wait and find out in the future will there be a man that's not mortal. We know it's part of the nature of the human person. If we start talking in terms of what we know about a thing, its essence, we automatically are almost walking our way to natural law. That's not necessary with propositional logic, okay? So I'm not here to trash propositional logic, because you guys probably get some logic, in calculus and such. All I'm saying is that this is a different application of it, and it's more commonsensical, and it'll also more applicable to our lives, and it also will help us lead us towards natural law ethics. Okay. Rather than you reading it, it was in the book, I wanted to cover it, but this is the extent of it. So as long as you know what I mean by epistemologism, I know the reality, and that it could foster utilitarian ethics, this is it.
So part means against, so like the definitions you gave, like
Yes.
against the definitions.
That's right,
Yeah,
absolutely.
make sure.
So the fact that epistemological realism is you can know reality, propositional logic, it kind of goes against that idea, okay? And again, I just want to do one slide because I thought if it's in a book, it's worth covering. But it's better that you got this from the one slide from me than reading it. If you don't quite understand this, it really will affect nothing with the course. Because we're going to go over all this stuff, okay? So what I want to do now is I want to go through the 3 acts of the mind. And I have very little to say about each of them because we will go through all of them in length. Before that, let me just say this so that you get why I'm doing this, okay? First of all, your thinking and your structure about thinking determines your worldview. If anybody's pondering that this is not applicable to you, you're going to develop some sort of worldview in your life or an ideology. And it is going to be based on how you think and how you structure your thought. So it's important that you know how you're doing that. Otherwise, you're just a piece of dead wood going down the stream of culture. So I'm asking you, again, think for yourself, all right? As far as the Aristotelian logic approach, it's just the 3 acts of the mind, okay? The Aristotelian logic approach is just the 3 acts of the mind. And you guys knew that I know I said it, if I didn't make it part of the course, that when I taught you morality and sacraments, this is how I taught you. I taught you definitions, I put them into truth statements, and then I made an argument. That's the 3 acts of the mind. That's what I was doing the whole time. It doesn't matter what neuroscience discovers. They're not going to undo this, okay? They might say, we're discovering better ways that a person can learn. That's great, but we're still going to go through the 3 acts of the mind, okay? This is not going to go out of style. All right, so the first act of the mind. It's known as simple apprehension. There's just 3 little bullet points under each of these. And it's pretty simple. And this stuff's all in your book, okay? I'm just condensing it for you. So you will have to list the 3 acts of the mind. The first one is simple apprehension. It always results in a term, okay? We're talking about just a term. Terms can, and this is where you need to know for your quiz over the weekend. Terms can only be clear and unclear. That's it. If I say the apple, is that true or false? Yeah, as silly as that sounds, then you get it. Yeah, a term cannot be true or false. It can only be clear or unclear. Now, we're going to talk more about this, so I have a lot more to say, but not today. Now, what a term does is it reveals an essence about a thing. So it's answering the question, what the thing is, right? So when I say it's the apple, I am saying that we know what an apple is. See, you need realism here. I can't say like, well, do we really know what an apple means? Because an apple could mean different things. We have to know what an apple is. Now, here's examples of terms. Man. We know what a man is. We're not confused about what a man, I'm talking about mankind. If they have any issues with pronouns or man or they or we or she, he has a nice little footnote where he explains there's no other way to say it, all right, logically. Socrates, it's a particular term, but it's a term. Be like me, Steve, that's a term, okay? Mortal, we know what mortal means, we know what Socrates means, we know what man means. So those are clear terms, okay? Once we know those, we can move on to the second act of the mind. The second act of the mind is judgment. Now, here's how you know that you have, and this ends in a proposition. How do you know you have a proposition? Can you say it's true or false? Now, here's where you're going to have to clear up some bad habits. Because you might have already thought you can say an argument is true or false. You can't. You can only say a proposition is true or false. And we'll see that in a sec why. So what does the second act of the mind reveal? It reveals an existence. In other words, rather than saying what it is, as an essence, we're saying whether it is. So we know what men are, that's a term. We know what mortal is, that's a term. We can now complete a proposition and say all men are mortal. That's either true or false. If I said all men are tall, that would be false. We'd also have an unclear term because I don't know anything what tall is. I'm tall if you put me into a room of kindergarten kids. You put me in a room of basketball players or normal people and I'm not tall. My doctor says I'm too short for my weight. So this always ends in a proposition and it's always true or false. So if you can say that is true or false, then you know you're looking at a proposition. If you can only say that it's clear or unclear and you can't say it's true or false, then you're looking at a term. All right? And we're going to practice this. And we're going to practice the evens that are already in your book, but I'd like to do it here so I can say why it is or is not. The last act of the mind is reasoning, even though I have discursive reasoning there. It's just important that you know it's reasoning. And this is it. Then after this, we're going to do a couple exercises. This act of the mind ends in a syllogism. A syllogism is an argument. A syllogism is only ever valid or invalid. If I say to you, all men are mortal, Socrates is man and Socrates is mortal, you might say that's true, thinking of the last sentence. But an argument cannot be true. This is why you can talk to somebody you disagree with and say they have a valid argument without agreeing with them. Wouldn't that be nice in politics? You know, could you imagine two candidates in a debate saying, it's a very good argument, but I disagree with one of your premises. You know it's going to be in the news. You know, this person agrees with the other person's argument. I mean, then we're all off and running. I mean, this is why we have a hard time having conversations. So this reveals the cause. Why is it? All right? Now, I'm not so much worried that you know those things. What's so important that you know is that this ends in a syllogism and it's valid or invalid. And there is the classic syllogism. You'll hear this and read this in every logic course that ever was done with me. And all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Socrates is mortal. If you agree with those first two premises and disagree with the third, we can't talk with you. Those two premises, once you agree with them, and if this argument's valid, you have no choice but to agree with the end. You could just deny it, but you're living in, you know, your own little fairyland. Because the premise, if the conclusion naturally flows from the premise of a valid argument, you can't disagree. All right? We can argue about one of the propositions, whether or not it's true or not. You know, like those are pretty solid. But if it was a proposition you didn't agree with, you know, we could argue about the truth of the proposition. But nonetheless. Okay, so once again, terms come from simple apprehension, first act of the mind. They're either clear or unclear. Propositions come from judgment, second act of the mind. They're either true or untrue. And then syllogisms come from the third act of the mind. They're either valid or invalid. And that's it. So what I want to do now, and if you want to save yourself writing, then just write down the number